a very short introduction from my side to the audience. Rafael de Bivar Marquese is professor of history at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And his publications include, and I don't give now the Brazilian titles, but the tentative translations into English. His publications include Administration and Slavery, Ideas about the Administration of the Brazilian Slave Agriculture, which has been published in 1999. The second book with the title Names of the Body, Makers of the Body, Missionaries of the Mind, Master Scholars, and the Control of Slaves in the Americas, 1660 to 1860, published in 2004. Slavery and Politics, Brazil and Cuba, 1790 to 1850. That came out 2016. And then another book, The Plural Times. I don't know whether this year you have to explain it, Os Tempos Plurais, The Plural Times.
That's it.
That's it, of Slavery in Brazil, Essays on History and Hagiography, published 2020, and last but not least, a book with the title Reconstruction of the Landscapes of Slavery, a Visual History of the Plantation in the 19th Century Atlantic World, which has been recently published by the University of North Carolina Press, recently means last year, in 2021. So everybody sees that Rafael is a very, very productive and, of course, a very well-known scholar. And Rafael, the floor is yours, and I'm especially looking forward to hearing your talk. So thank you again for coming, and, well, please.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Let me share my presentation. Thanks for the invitation, Ian, for arranging all this, and Janine for the original invitation. It's a really, really great pleasure to be invited to participate in this lecture series in the honor of a dear and admired historian. I'd like to take this opportunity to present the general outline of a broader project that I have been developing over the last decade, and which I hope will soon become a book. It's a global history of slavery and other forms of asymmetric dependent labor, employing the coffee economy in longue durée. To begin with, I believe it's appropriate to briefly explain the path that brought me here in order to clearly indicate what I intend to do with this book and how it's directly related to the concerns that have driven the collective work promoted by this center. My trajectory has so far been marked by the attempt to understand African slavery in the Americas through the prism of historical comparison. Thus, in my two first books, I analyzed ideas related to slave and plantation management in Brazil, the British, the French, and the Spanish Caribbean, and the US South between the 17th and the 19th centuries. More recently, in two co-authored books, I have investigated the politics of slavery in Brazil and Cuba between 1790 and 1850, as well as the built environments and the landscapes of the 19th century slave plantations in Brazil, Cuba, and the United States. As a Brazilian historian, my basic impulse for these comparative studies has always been motivated by my permanent attentiveness to the place of the Brazilian slave system within the broader history of modern slavery. While developing this research program, I noticed a clear imbalance between the available historiography on slavery and the sugar economy and the coffee economy. Since the 1940s, scholars from different historiographical traditions compared the New World slaveholding sugar zones, pointing out the ruptures that occurred in the industry over an extended time frame, most notably in the Caribbean. Such endeavors, however, did not extend to slavery in the coffee economy. What stands out is the lack of a comparative and integrated analysis on a global scale, assessing the decisive role played by African slavery in the global trajectory of the coffee economy during the 18th and the 19th centuries. Take, for instance, the case of three solid, large edited volumes on the global coffee economy, which are still by far the best material we have for an overview of the theme. The first, edited by Michel Toucherer in 2001, dealt exclusively with the coffee trade structured around the peasant economy of Yemen in the 16th and the 17th centuries, thus before the creation of slaveholding coffee complexes in the Atlantic. The two others explored later periods, the diversity of social relations, economic activities, and the political structures of Latin American coffee-producing countries between the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century received careful attention in the volume edited by Roseberry, Gudmundsson, and Samper in 1995. Similarly, the book coordinated by Clarence Smith and Stephen Topic in 2003 sought to broaden the geographical scope of these themes by examining the origins of the global coffee economy, their hierarchies of race, gender, and class in different producing regions of the world, as well as the connections between the coffee economy, political dynamics, and the building of national states. However, it's really striking that New World slavery was completely ignored in these two late volumes. Among their 25 chapters, not a single one dealt with the main coffee-producing zones after 1750 and the entire 19th century, the French colony of Saint-Domingue and the Empire of Brazil, both based on slavery. These three edited volumes were published almost 2 decades ago, but the problem persists. In 2019, Stuart McCook released a groundbreaking book on the global history of the coffee leaf rust. His focus is on the environmental history of the coffee economy after the emergence of this disease in the 1870s. Labor in coffee production, of course, is not McCook's immediate concern, but the precise nature of the coffee collapse in British Ceylon and Dutch Java amidst the impacts of the rust plague cannot be understood without taking into account the decisive role of Brazilian slavery in determining the general economic conditions of these two spaces. A few years earlier, the Jamaican sociologist James Talbot published an inspiring essay on the coffee commodity chain, drawing on Brodel and Arrighi's conceptualization of the capitalist world economy and the systemic cycles of accumulation of historical capitalism. Talbot clarifies several trends and transformations that marked the global trajectory of the coffee economy, but unfortunately, he doesn't pay the due attention to the fundamental changes in the forms of asymmetric dependent labor that conditioned them. Finally, also in 2019, Stephen Topic, one of the world's leading experts on the global history of coffee, wrote about Brazil's place in the formation of the global coffee economy in the long 19th century, questioning the decisive role of slavery in that trajectory. According to him, I'm quoting him, slave labor has been given too much credit for the coffee boom, since the explosion of coffee cultivation in the first half of the 19th century in Brazil was not brought about by new production methods. Even with Brazil, along with Java and Ceylon, greatly expanding global production in the first half of the 19th century, Topic concludes, the essential nature of the coffee commodity chain remained unchanged. End of the citation. The assumption that informs him is that African slavery has always been the same in the Americas. If Brazilian coffee planters continued to use slave labor throughout the 19th century, what happened was a simple repetition of a previous pattern without any relevant historical novelty. In order to evaluate this type of a statement, we need a long-term, simultaneously diachronic and synchronic comparative perspective, which has at its core the problem of the historicity of the forms of asymmetric dependent labor mobilized for the production of coffee. This is the basic question that is guiding me in my project on the global history of coffee and slavery, and it's precisely at this point that it becomes directly connected to the overall concerns of the Bond Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies. I'm using this opportunity to bring you in the most concise and objective way the general outline of my inquiry. In my paper, firstly, I explain how I'm organizing my empirical material. The historicity of the forms of asymmetric dependent labor discussed here can be better understood from their place within three different global coffee economies that overlapped in time from the mid-16th century to the beginning of the 20th century. In my extended paper that I prepared for this lecture, I take 25 pages describing these three global coffee economies. I simply cannot present all these pages here and now, otherwise we will jump from a 40 minutes lecture to at least a 2 hours lecture. I will present them in a very schematic way, just nominating their main characteristics and the different labor regimes within each one of them. Most importantly, I think, is the second part of my presentation, where I discuss the three main theoretical and methodological axes that guide my project. So, to begin with, the first global coffee economy. The first global coffee economy, which holds from the 16th century to the early 18th century, had the following characteristics. First, it was built upon the urban markets of Eastern Mediterranean within the realm of the Ottoman Empire. Second, highland Yemen, since the 1630s, independent from the Ottoman Empire, exercised full monopoly over production. Third, this first global economy was regulated by the logic of a tributary, therefore non-capitalist, world economy, the Ottoman world economy. Fourth, during the whole 17th century, there was a striking market equilibrium in this economy. Prices in Egypt, the trading hub of Yemeni coffee, didn't face major oscillations, while the Yemeni volume of exports always moved around 9,000 tons. Fifth, all this production came from a free peasantry toiling on Yemen's terraces. Slavery had no place in highland terraced agriculture of Yemen. Between the 1550s and the 1570s, when the Ottomans stimulated coffee cultivation in the highlands, it was easily incorporated into the polyculture that was already practiced there. The mountains had ideal rainfall and climatic conditions for the new plant. Free peasant families, organized on a tribal basis on small villages at the top of the mountains, cultivated coffee trees, shaded or not, depending on the specific humidity of each microclimate, on their centuries-old terraces along with bananas, mangoes, lemons, herbs, and cereals. The cultural treatment given to coffee trees were intensive. The scale of the plantations was very small, always less than 1,000 trees per family unit. The focus of the peasant households was on foodstuffs. Coffee provided them with an additional cash nexus without fundamentally changing the independent way of life of their tribal communities. Coffee processing was segmented. Peasant households dried the cherries with their pulp and parchment on the roof of their houses located in the mountain villages until they were sufficiently dry to remove the layers of plant material. Within the dry caucus, coffee beans could be stored for a long time before being sold to local traders, who were responsible for the final separation of its husk. For this, they employed day-wage laborers who worked with a rudimentary hand-operated stone mill capable of processing no more than 40 kilograms of coffee per day. The construction of the second global coffee economy had as its starting point the so-called West Indies sugar revolution, which took place from the mid-17th century. This revolution, in turn, was part of the broader process of the birth of the consumer society. In the second half of the 17th century, in emulation of the Ottoman model, a solid culture of public cafes appeared in northwestern Europe, and by the end of the century, there was an established, albeit fairly modest, European consumer market. The bottleneck for this growth was on the supply side, the Yemeni monopoly. This problem was decisive impetus for the construction of the Dutch and French coffee plantation systems, which started relatively quickly. Between the 1720s and the 1740s, the coffee bush was successfully acclimated in places as diverse as the island of Java and Bourbon in the Indian Ocean, and Suriname, Martinique, and Saint-Domingue in the West Indies. The slave plantation model was immediately adopted in all of them except Java. Despite regional variation, coffee production on the West Indies slave plantations shared several commonalities. The break from the previous Yemeni experience was clear. Coffee trees were planted in strict geometric order with a standard spacing between the rows. Aligning and cutting the bushes were mechanisms originally conceived to facilitate the control of the slaves' labor process through their visualization. Processing also underwent important changes. Unlike Yemen, drying of grains and subsequent removal of pulp and parchment began to be done entirely within the plantation, with new machinery especially conceived for coffee production. In a few decades, the slave plantation colonies run by European powers came to dominate more than half of the world's coffee production. At the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, 1755, Suriname and Saint-Domingue each accounted for about 10% of the world supply. Over the next 10 years, both colonies expanded, together accounting for about 35% of the supply. After that moment, 1765, there was a decisive bifurcation. While Suriname stagnated, Saint-Domingue experienced a remarkable leap forward. Its coffee production increased sixfold in 25 years before the slave revolution, enabling it to account for half of the world's supply. Slave productivity was almost the same in both colonies. But because of the spatial economy of coffee production on marsh and tidewater zones, coffee lands were 7 times more expensive in Suriname than in Saint-Domingue. The relative cost of production factors, articulated through specific spatial economies, determined the overall performance of the coffee economy in each colony. If, on the one hand, the Saint-Domingue coffee industry represented the apogee of the second global coffee economy, the first to be based on the massive enslavement of Africans, on the other hand, it was also a crucial force in its crisis. The coffee boom in Saint-Domingue, decades before the outbreak of the French Revolution, was fundamentally led by white resident slaveholders. Free blacks and mulattoes were also producing coffee with slave labor, but in absolute numbers and investments, they were well behind the whites. White coffee planters differed from the large absentee sugar planters residing in France in one crucial respect. It was them, the white coffee planters, who articulated the autonomist platform that led to the exclusion of the Saint-Domingue free blacks and mulattoes from the political rights. One of the conditions for the success of the slave rebellion of August 1791 was precisely this racial division between slaveholders residing in Saint-Domingue. Similarly, white autonomist coffee planters were at the forefront of the maneuver that facilitated the British invasion of 1793, which backfired with the Jacobin decree abolishing slavery in 1794 and the definitive rise of Toussaint Louverture's command in 1795. The Haitian Revolution and the Industrial Revolution were the main forces behind the takeoff of the third global coffee economy, whose axis would be outside the Caribbean. As part of the same unified historical process, while the second economy fell into crisis, the third was already in the making. It would be led by the slave production of Brazil, followed by the Dutch colony of Java, with forced peasant labor under the cultivation system, and the British colony of Ceylon, with a peculiar scheme of unfree wage labor called the Kangani system. In my paper, I try to explain carefully the structural interconnections between these two profoundly different forms of asymmetric dependent labor in coffee production. Brazil would be the new leading space, far ahead of Java and Ceylon. As the world price maker, the Brazilian slave system would set up the conditions for labor exploitation in Ceylon and Java. The fabric of this third global coffee economy was determined in many ways by the dual axis of British anti-slave trade foreign policy and its hegemony over a new industrial global economic order, but also by the multiple dynamics of local social relations of forces. The Paraíba Valley, comprising lands in the provinces of Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and Minas Gerais in Brazil, became the main coffee producing region in the world, with 50% of the world supply in the mid-19th century. The nomadic indigenous populations that inhabited the region until the end of the previous century were expelled or exterminated. With ideal topography, soil, and climate conditions, the initial productivity of its coffee plantations proved to be much higher than in the Caribbean. From 1830 onwards, coffee production in Paraíba Valley found a new consumer market, the United States. In the mid-19th century, the US share of coffee imports in the world market was 1/4, surpassing historical consumers such as the Netherlands, France, the northern Italian peninsula, Scandinavian countries, the German Zollverein, and the Austrian Empire. The most relevant is that 90% of US coffee imports in 1850 came from a single source, Paraíba Valley. But the historical novelty of Paraíba Valley was also based on a new slave plantation. Its planters took the general principle of coffee agronomy created in the Caribbean, the extensive exploitation of natural resources by the intensive exploitation of the slaves, to a new level. This was made possible by the scale of the plantations. Its dimensions in spatial and human terms were much larger than those of Saint-Domingue, Jamaica, and Cuba. The vertically aligned planting of the coffee trees, common to all hilly regions of slave production, acquired another configuration in the Paraíba Valley, dictated by the management of the labor process. The distance between the vertically aligned rows was much greater, which allowed the foremen, who are the base of the hills, greater visual control over the pace of work of a large group of slaves. The implication was an enormous waste of land, and above all, erosion processes that in 2 decades completely depleted the soil's natural resources. Since properties in the Paraíba Valley were huge, with large forest reserves, new plantings were carried out regularly, which kept their general productivity at high levels for some time at the cost of rapid environmental degradation. Slaves in Paraíba Valley were forced to cultivate far more coffee trees and to pick much more cherries than their Caribbean counterparts. This intensive exploitation of slaves demanded new machinery to process a much larger amount of cherries. The slave-based coffee plantations in Brazil became the main lossy of technological innovation in coffee processing, in a logic that searched quantity, not quality of the final product. The result of this spatial economy in terms of labor productivity was simply astonishing. In 1950, slaves on coffee plantations in Paraíba Valley were producing 1,000 to 1,200 kilograms of coffee a year, 5 to 6 times more than slaves in Saint Domingue and Suriname. The comparison with Ceylon and Java is even more impressive. Forced workers in these two Indian Ocean colonies produced far less coffee per capita than Brazil's planters extracted for them from their slaves. Slavery in the third global coffee economy was not a simple repetition of the same old phenomena, as Stephen Topic argued. It was, in fact, a new slavery, a second slavery. At that time, the transition to the fourth global coffee economy had already begun. Two events marked its birth, part of the crisis of the third economy. The first was the rust plague itself, which, by decimating the productivity of coffee trees in the Indian Ocean, finally opened space for new areas, with new spatial economies and new labor arrangements to enter the world market. This was the opportunity seized by Latin American producers. The second event was the crisis of slavery in Brazil, which was part of the systemic crisis of the second slavery, beginning with the US Civil War. The Great Conflict of 1861 to 1865 not only inaugurated the chain of events that would lead to the abolition of Brazilian slavery in 1888, but also represented a fundamental transformation in the global patterns of capital accumulation. The full history of this fourth post-slavery global coffee economy will not be told in my book. I will only suggest how many of the broader lines of this fourth economy, especially its permanent tendency to overproduction, with the subsequent need for the state to intervene in the structure of supply through the so-called valorization schemes, were a direct unfolding of the spatial economy created by the past slave relations. So, after this sketch and somewhat simple-minded representation of the three global coffee economies and their labor regimes, I just hope that you will be able to read my 25 pages as soon as it appears in the publication series of these lectures. Now I have to move to theory and methodology, which will take the rest of my time. In each wave of expansion that marked the transition from a given global coffee economy to the following, the new leading space always established the conditions in which the space that had preceded it and its contemporaries were going to operate. This is what happened with Saint Domingue in relation to Yemen and Suriname, or the Paraíba Valley in relation to the Caribbean, Haiti, Jamaica, Cuba, and Java, Ceylon. The observation and analysis of these spatial-temporal overlaps constitute an important task to understand the relationships between the different forms of asymmetric dependent labor mobilized globally for coffee production. I will try now to give substance to this idea through a description of the three main theoretical and methodological axes that guide the investigation. I start with the concept of spatial economy. This is not about the spatial economics of economists, which is usually concerned with the variables that condition the spatial allocation of production factors or with the financial dynamics in the reconfiguration of large urban centers. My use here is more specific, referring primarily to the analysis of the articulation of coffee production unit to the rhythms and broader transformations of the world economy. The first issue to examine when dealing with the spatial economy is the botany of the plant itself. The coffee Arabica variety, the only one that was commercially cultivated in the period I am analyzing, originates from the highland forests of southwest Ethiopia, a tropical zone marked by moderate average temperatures and high rainfall. In the wild, where they grow sheltered from isolation under the shade of up to 3 levels of overlapping treetops, the coffee Arabica bushes reach a height of 6 meters, but they produce few fruits, just essential for the survival of the species. Since the rise of Yemen, the commercial cultivation of the shrub has always involved cultural practice that evidently sought a substantial increase in food production. These treatments were diverse: planting with or without alignment, shading, containment of slopes, fertilization, low cutting of the coffee trunk, pruning, intercropping of foodstuffs. Each of these choices refer to different forms of social organization of labor. Regardless of multiple local variations, all commercial cultivation experiments around the globe have had to deal with the natural history of the plant, that is, with its immediate botanical determinations. Besides that, commercial crops like coffee almost always involve some kind of complex combination between agriculture and processing. Given its specific characteristics, coffee processing is a relatively simple physical process, consisting of drying the harvest cherry and separating the two layers of plant material that cover it, the pulp and the parchment. There were, however, different technical possibilities for doing so, which in turn again relate to an ever broader set of substantive historical social relations. The second question concerns the immediate environmental conditions where coffee production took place, evidently a consequence of the plant's natural history. Cultivation of the shrub is only viable in intertropical zones with humidity and temperatures that are not far from those conditions of the original habitat. But even here, the spectrum of possibilities is considerable: topography, altitude, climate, hydrology, soils, existence of native forest cover of previous crops. Each of these elements implied a series of consequences for coffee production and how it was socially organized. The third question focused on the process of appropriation of nature, the previous land uses before the rise of the coffee economy, and during and after its formation, land-owning patterns. These relationships always refer to political power in its relations with social and economic power. The spectrum of variation here, again, is enormous. All this process of formation of patterns of land ownership referred ultimately to the state, whether tributary, colonial, or liberal, which means that political power was an essential institutional force of the spatial economies of the coffee production units. And also that these processes were never exclusively local, given that each of these political entities was part of a historically encompassing interstate system. The next question also concerns the relationship between society and nature. In this fourth step, the analysis of spatial economy turns to the production and labor processes in agriculture, which never coincide. The idea is to examine how landscape management strategies were related to labor management strategies. Scale of production units, spatial combination between new, mature, and exhausted coffee fields, pastures, fallow areas, virgin forest reserves, combination of crops, coffee foodstuffs, and pastures for livestock, methods of arranging coffee plantations, distance between coffee rows, horizontality, verticality of coffee lines, weeding area, number of coffee bushes allocated to each worker, internal transport system of the plantation, articulations between cultivated fields and built environments for processing the coffee. The combination of all this constitutes what I'm calling landscape management. Each of these choices was in turn directly related to strategies for coordinating collective labor, mechanisms of supervision, reward and punishment, organization of work in the weeding of coffee plantations, at harvest, in transport to processing, in the production of foodstuffs, in processing. To understand such strategies, demography, numbers of workers, balanced by age, gender, origin, and race, must come to the forefront of the investigation. This analytical pair, landscape management, labor management, allows us to descend to the ground floor, to the concrete and immediate process of material and social transformation of the worlds of labor within very specific productive units, giving us a more solid basis to examine the particularities that distinguish labor forms that are often taken as unchanging. Examining the relationship between landscape management and labor management sheds light on the historicity of forms of asymmetric dependence. A crucial methodological procedure is to avoid treating these four issues, as variables, as processes that are external and independent of each other. We must conceive these four steps, first of all, as specific moments of a totality in permanent movement, that is, a totality shaped by the always discontinuous temporal rhythms of each of these specific moments that compose it. Such a totality must be constructed as an open one, presupposing contradictions and movements, and gaining continuous analytical additions by incorporating other equally open totalities. The opposite would be to conceive it as a closed, finished, absolute, and immutable entity. This is about operating with the meaning of a concrete totality as being a totality by relation and not a totality by addition. Such observations led us directly to the two other theoretical methodological axes that guide the investigation, namely, a perspective of substantive comparison and a theory of plural historical times. The project deals directly with different types of labor. In the long trajectory of the global coffee economy between the mid-16th century and the end of the 19th century, forms as diverse as free peasant labor, Yemen, Haiti, forced peasant labor, Java, chattel slavery, Martinique, Bourbon, Saint-Domingue, Suriname, Jamaica, Cuba, Brazil, and compulsory wage labor, Ceylon, were mobilized for commodity production. Identifying the specific traits of each of them is essential for the analysis. But if we keep ourselves only at this level, we run the risk of falling into a simple typological formulation. The question, of course, is how to avoid this. Two seminal articles stand out here, with immediate methodological consequences for the history I'm trying to tell. The first is by Philip McMichael, whose target is the encompassing comparison proposals of Immanuel Wallerstein and Charles Tilly. McMichael recognized that these two sociologists brought a great advance in relation to the current formal procedures of comparison in the historical social sciences, which seek to identify similarities and differences between phenomena that present a certain essential analogy with each other. The formal comparison thus performed simply reaffirms, through contrast, the always unique and specific character of each compared unit. Wallerstein and Tilly, on the contrary, sought precisely to examine the systemic structural interconnections between the compared units. But Wallerstein and Tilly ended up explaining their similarities and divergences as consequences of their relations with a previous given analytic whole, such as Wallerstein's word system. Yet, the result is the creation of a mechanical field of determinations, projecting a preconceived model onto history, which leaves aside a good part of its dynamics and particularities. Instead of assuming the rule of the parts by the whole, the incorporated comparison proposed by Philip McMichael aims to capture the global systemic interconnections in their fluidity in view of the mutual conditioning between parts and whole. In this approach, McMichael's approach, the whole is a methodical construction obtained by the embedded analysis of the parts. Rather than a theoretical or empirical premise, totality is thus a result of the investigation procedure itself. What is the methodological consequence of McMichael's arguments for my project? The global coffee economies that I am examining must be analytically constructed as the arrival point of the incorporated comparison between the different producing regions and their respective forms of labor that constitute them, and not as the point of departure of the investigation. The second article is by Dale Tomish, who is close to McMichael's argument, but with some crucial additions. Tomish presents his argument based on a concrete exercise of comparison, taking two slave-holding sugar spaces that were contemporaneous, namely the colonies of Martinique and Cuba in the 19th century. He then contrasts the procedures that would be adopted in a conventional formal comparison with those of a substantive comparison. In a formal comparison, the specific constellation of land, labor, and capital in the two islands would be compared in their similarities and differences, reinforcing at the end of the exercise the irreducible uniqueness of each one. In a substantive comparison, the one proposed by Dale Tomish, Martinique and Cuba would be understood as mutually formative spaces, based on a careful analysis of the historical temporalities of each. Martinique's slavery played an important role in shaping the world sugar market between 1660 and 1790, having helped to establish its general conditions when Cuba entered it after the outbreak of the Atlantic Revolutionary cycle. However, throughout the first half of the 19th century, by transforming the very nature of that market, Cuban slavery was decisive in changing the general framework in which slavery was reproduced in Martinique. Martinique and Cuba, argues the Tomish, were subject to the same world time in the 19th century. But due to their specific process of constitution, to their specific times, they do not belong to a singular time of historical formation. From the perspective of substantive comparison, the social historical construction of temporal spatial processes and relations must itself become an object of inquiry. Methodological consequence of David Thomas' argument for my investigation. The distinct coffee regions and the respective labor modalities that I'm comparatively examining must be conceptualized as mutually formative through the specific evolving relationships that each space had within a given global coffee economy. These methodological notes call attention to the treatment of historical time, conceptualized not as linear, but as plural. I believe that the relevance of the method of substantive comparison for the integrated and relational analysis of the forms of asymmetric dependence will become clear if we move on to the third theoretical and methodological axis. My investigation operates with ordinal numbers that serve as temporal and conceptual markers for the large time blocks being examined. I speak of a first, a second, a third global coffee economy, or a first and a second slavery. These markers do not signal moments that follow each other linearly, the second completely replacing the first, the third the second, and so on and so forth. In fact, they point to the existence of historical structures, the global coffee economy, slavery, that overlap in time. In this sense, the inquirer adopts a theoretical perspective directly inspired by Fernand Braudel and Reinhard Koselleck. As we all know, Braudel was the creator of the concept of longue durée that goes in the title of this paper. The expression appears with some frequency in efforts to write the global history of slavery, being, for example, mobilized by Joseph Miller in his last book. However, it's almost always taken as synonymous with a long period of time, which ends up neglecting the core of the temporal argument embedded in the original formulation of the concept. The Braudelian longue durée necessarily presupposes the short time of the event to make sense. The emphasis of Braudel's theorization always falls on the dialectic of duration, on the plurality of historical times, and not just on the chronologically dilated time frame. Structure is taken as an analytical concept, not as a descriptive term, and as such, it opposes and it's dialectically articulated to the concept of event. As mainstays and obstacles, long-term temporal structures established in each historically given circumstance the horizon of the possible, what can be done in a given space of human action based on past legacies. When something happens at the level of the events that have cumulatively thickened, surpassing this horizon of the possible, what we have is already a structure in the process of transformation. Hence, the crucial relevance for Braudel of his dialogue with Jean-Paul Sartre. It's true that events belong to the scale of short duration, but Braudel recognized the weight of the philosopher's argument that, I'm citing Braudel now, an event, at very last, may include a series of meanings and familiarities. It sometimes offers a glimpse of very deep movements, and by the perhaps artificially produced game of causes and effects dear to the historians in the past, it can include a time far longer than its own duration. End of quotation. Such conceptualization is part, in Braudel's words, and now I'm seeing Braudel again, of this intelligent and dangerous game that Jean-Paul Sartre's reflections propose. End of citation. What could be the intelligent and dangerous in Sartre? To see in the universal singularity of the individual, in the plot of past and present particular events that mark the life of each one of us, the multiple articulations of much wider space-time scales. In other words, structural scales. But not only that, in order to apprehend the totality in the event, to use the progressive regressive method, that is, the permanent movement of back and forth, va-et-vient, that's Sartre's very expression. So, the permanent movement of back and forth that runs through the complete hermeneutic circuit from the whole to the part, from the part to the whole, from abstract to concrete, from concrete to abstract, from present to past, from past to present, from biography to epoch, from epoch to biography. The event, in sum, is at the heart of Brodel's preoccupation with long-term temporal structures. And in this sense, the greatest follower of his theorization of historical time would be the German historian Reinhard Koselleck, who in distinct ways renewed and radicalized the Brodelian perspective. The first innovation in relation to Brodel consisted in grounding the theoretical elaboration of the meta-historical categories of experience and expectation. The relationships between the space of experience and horizon of expectations are not static. Koselleck's central thesis on the specific temporality of modernity consists precisely in pointing out the growing gap between the flattening of space of experiences and the widening of horizon of expectations, something that is related to the very transformation of the concept of history at the turn of the 19th century. The perception that time always marches forward in an univocal sense of continuous progress provided after that moment one of the most solid foundations for the construction of historical knowledge. However, the soaring mismatch between experience and expectation produced by the progressive acceleration of historical time also made it possible to become aware that the present time is always crossed by multiple and different past times. The empirical verification of the contemporaneity of non-contemporary actually predates the work of post-war II historians by at least a century and a half. From these two basic meta-historical concepts, experience and expectation, Koselleck founded the theoretical empirical treatment of layers of time. The essential characteristic of structures would be the temporal reiteration, the return of the same, even the same if the same changes in the medium and long term. In Koselleck's conceptualization, as in Brodel's conceptualization, structures have real historicity and more explicitly involve the different domains of the mental and material. Examples of a structure he provides include, citing Koselleck, constitutional models, productive forces in relation of production, geographic and spatial circumstances, unconscious patterns of behavior, natural successions of generations, customs and legal systems, among others. The lines of continuity with Brodel are evident. We're starting with the general assumption, quoting him again. More or less lasting structures, but in any case, long-term, are the condition of possible events. Both levels refer to each other without one dissolving into the other. In fact, and here we see the turn of the Brodelian hourglass, certain structures can only be apprehended in the events in which they are articulated and through which they allow themselves to be seen. The most adequate way of apprehending the processual character of modern history, concludes Koselleck, is the reciprocal clarification of events through structures and vice versa. Certain events, by bringing about a rupture in the order of time repetition, acquire a clear structural meaning. Conversely, certain non-immediate durations can become events. Furthermore, the temporalization of history that took place at the turn of the 19th century changed the nature of the interrelationships between structures and events. Structural change itself became an event. This is the characteristic of our modernity, writes Koselleck. To put in another way, one of the main manifestations of the acceleration of historical time of modernity lies precisely in the fact that historical structures can be of ever shorter duration. So, after the long description of my approach to the three global coffee economies, I hope you have noticed how I am concretely mobilizing this theory of plural-historical times to examine my topic. Concluding this lecture, I just want to name a few more explicit links to make my point as clear as possible. In identifying three temporarily overlapping global economies, I'm operating with the figure of thought of the contemporaneity of the non-contemporary as an analytical key to account for these overlaps. By observing local and immediate phenomena, such as the organization of a coffee crop with a given type of labor as part of long-term reiterative patterns that constitute a given global coffee economy, and conversely, how the fields of force of these economies create the very conditions of possibility for the emergence of historical novelties, I'm turning the hourglass of the dialectic of duration. When operating with the articulation between the wide spaces of a given global coffee economy, the much more restricted spatial configurations of its particular coffee plantations, I'm resorting to the back and forth method. By differentiating a first from a second slavery, Locating this turning point in the age of revolutions, I'm incorporating the argument of the acceleration of the historical time of modernity to address the historicity of forms of asymmetric dependence. I began with the concept of spatial economy, but perhaps the greatest potential for an integrated analysis of the forms of asymmetric dependence in a specific commodity chain lies in the theoretical treatment of plural historical times. I will consider all this as I finish my book, and for that I must thank you once again for the opportunity that the Bond Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies has given me to present its partial results. Thank you very much.